So, our last step in exploring media effects research is to understand how you can begin to ask a range of much more interesting questions about the role of media in society by replacing the question of what do things like violent content, what do they do to society, to asking questions of how they become involved in society. And this is the purpose of looking at Jonathan Pieslak's work. And Pieslak's work, which looked at the sort of music that US troops listened to in Iraq, he found, in fact, that one of the most popular tracks during that war was a track by Eminem called Go to Sleep, which was a rap about murdering someone and burying them. And Pieslak interviewed several troops who talked about the fact that this was a real favourite of theirs to listen to before they were on a mission. And this is a perfect example to talk about how concerns about the negative effects of media are actually a gateway to a range of very interesting and complex questions about how media become involved in in certain kinds of social conflicts. In this case, war and questions of social opportunity and the structure of media industries. So let's have a little look at what Pieslak had to say. So Pieslak talks about, as I mentioned, the fact that music was widely used in Iraq. And of course, the significance of this, the thing that's very unique about this case study is it talks about how violent media contributed to a situation, of course, that was already violent. And the thing that Pieslak studied in a very interesting manner through interviewing troops. So he was talking to troops rather than sticking them in an experiment or something like that. And he was talking about them in terms of how they used music to manage their moods. And Pieslak found that music was widely used in warfare, and that quite often Eminem was the track of choice for troops who were going on a combat mission. So when young troops were in a situation where they had to make themselves feel aggressive, Eminem was one of the things that they used to get them into that state. Now, the reason why this is such a significant case study is that no one is arguing here that Eminem caused aggression. So we have soldiers who are in a situation and they knowingly expose themselves to a type of music which is associated with aggression in order to achieve a certain sort of effect. But rather than looking simply at what the song did to the soldiers, and of course we already know that that's kind of a silly question because the soldiers were really doing it to themselves through the song, we need to ask why that song in that situation. What were the factors that led to a situation where soldiers thought it made sense to listen to Eminem as a tool to help them go through their mission? And the first thing is, of course, that there was simply the technology that allowed them to carry the music into the field. So the first question we would have to ask is, well, technologically, why did that happen? Why was listening to music a part of the ritual that soldiers used to manage their lives in Iraq? So there's a whole kind of ritualistic sense of the use of music as a whole that you need to understand before you get to Eminem. But then the next question is, well, why Eminem? And for our answers to those questions, we can kind of look at scholarship around the performative aspects of rap culture. So the writer Gil Rodman writes that rap is widely underappreciated as a style of performance. And the reason why this is a point worth noting, of course, is because it takes us back to Insane Clown Posse. Insane Clown Posse argued that they were really performers. They were acting a part on the stage in much the same way as an actor who acts the part of a murderer in a film is doing just that. It's not him or her. It's a performance. And this is actually quite common in rap culture. And Rodman writes that, we kind of have a hard time accepting that because there's this kind of implicit cultural bias that sees rappers as being playing themselves. But of course, if we think about some of the most notable rappers that we've had, it's very clear that they've managed to maintain a career by playing all kinds of different roles. And a fascinating figure in this regard is Snoop Doggy Dogg. Now, Snoop has become this kind of almost cuddly popular culture figure the Snoop that you know is probably the guy over here. So this is Snoop in his reality show that he shot with his kids. This is Snoop when he was Snoop Lion, when he went through a conversion to Rastafarianism. But it may surprise some of you to know that in his first incarnations, around 1992, 1993, Snoop very much drew on the image of the gangster. He was seen as a very threatening figure in American popular culture. He was seen as someone who kind of glorified a gangster lifestyle. Of course, he was tried for murder in real life. And the early publicity around him mentioned things like his affiliation with street gangs and that sort of thing. But as time has gone on, we've clearly seen the way that Snoop plays different parts. So there was the kind of the pimp period, I guess. And he's really kind of, in his later career, he looks back on this kind of image and says, this really kind of wasn't me. And the point that Rodman makes is that actually this is very characteristic of rap culture, where you have certain sorts of figures who very much play roles. And equally, if you look at other research on rap, it's made the point that violence is actually accounts for a very small proportion of rap content. Much more rap content is actually about making money and about promoting the figure not of the gangster, but of the musical entrepreneur. And we've accepted this in regard to other musical styles. So below here we have the late, great David Bowie, who's worth checking out because he quite often talks about, so this is David Bowie in what was known as his Ziggy Stardust era, where he was, again, playing a character, a fictional character. And there are some fascinating interviews with Bowie where he talks about this period of his life where he really kind of lost himself in that particular performance. But again, he looked back on this period of his life and said, well, that really wasn't me. This was a period of my life when I was completely lost in a performance that I had a hard time getting out of. So one of the reasons why American soldiers listen to rap is that through a set of, well, firstly because they could, but secondly, rap has been culturally positioned as a musical form where, because the performative element is downplayed, where there are stories about, so when Eminem sings a song about murdering someone and burying them, we kind of assume that there's an element of reportage there, that he's playing that in the first person in a way that other performers don't. So part of the reason why soldiers listen to rap to make themselves aggressive is because our culture tells us that it's aggressive musical form, and that's how we associate with it. And that's a matter of cultural preference. That's a matter of the way that media industries work. It's not a matter of anything that's actually in the song. Now, an added onus here is that it really kind of describes, so we've kind of got this situation where we've got musical performers. And of course, Eminem is fascinating in this because he's another rapper who has drawn attention to his own role playing. So if you think about one of his early raps, a rap called The Way I Am, he talks about the fact that he plays different roles. It's significant that he's had three different names: Eminem, Slim Shady, Marshall Mathers. And this is a way of drawing attention to the fact that he is a public performer. So if you listen to that rap, I am whoever you say I am. In the newspapers, the news people say I'm this, that, and the other. So very much drawing attention to the fact that rappers are playing a part. So we have this whole kind of history where musical performers will talk about sort of, playing parts in their earlier performances and moving on. And the thing that I find really fascinating about Peaslak's account is you can actually see that there's a parallel between a rapper who is playing a part and the situation the soldiers find themselves in. So quite often what you see in Peaslak's work, when he's talking to soldiers about how they feel about the job that they do fighting and killing people, they talk about it as if it's not something they want to do, it's something they've been pushed into. And they talk about it as if it's a part that they play. So when they go into combat, they hype themselves up to get their artificially aggressive so that they can go out, much like the rappers, and play a part that isn't really them. And so one of the most interesting things about the rap in this particular study was not that it just made them aggressive, but it also provided them a language to make sense of their role and make sense of a situation where they were going out to do something that really wasn't in character for them. So there's a whole range of questions behind. You can look at, did listening to this particular song make people aggressive? And it's kind of a silly question because the thing that made them aggressive was the fact that they were in the army and they were being given weapons and they were told to shoot people. But what's far more interesting is the question as to why this particular media form was seen as being particularly aggressive, and how the way that the media form functions, rap as a cultural icon, the notion of the rap performer, actually suited the life narrative of the listener. And so there are all kinds of really fascinating questions about, firstly, why was it there available to consume? And also, what were the motivations that the soldiers had to listen to this music? So this is why we shift from asking whether media causes violence to how it is that media becomes involved in violence and social conflicts. It's a much more complicated story that has to do with the context of the listener and indeed the motivations and the operations of media industries. So whenever you're talking about media effects, you need to think about those two things. What are the motivations of the listeners or the users? And of course, remember, Albert Bandura, the founder of social learning theory, would 100% agree with you on this. And then the second thing you have to ask is, how is it that certain sorts of media forms are associated with certain sorts of media effects? So here are some questions that you can try out in your first essays. Are there political or cultural reasons why society worries about some kinds of media and not others? How can concepts of risk be related to social identities, socialization, identities, and social values? How do young people view the risks of media? Do they worry about the same things that concern academics and institutions? And how can media users experience of risky media? How can media users experience risky media use in positive ways? So, for example, can you find friendship through playing online games? So that is a third thing to think about in terms of media effects, which relates to the cultural and political and user-based perspectives on how it is that certain sort of content is related to certain sorts of outcomes.